Thanks very much for coming today, everybody. And we've set up this webinar to talk about the government's consultation on regulations for mobility devices. We're looking at how new regulations can provide equal mobility rights for all. This is a whistle-stop tour of a really complicated area. There are loads more resources on our website, and as Ben said, the transcript and slides are already up online. We will be putting a recording up online, but that's likely to be the next webinar from the 12th of February because we should have BSL interpreters at that one. On this slide, there are drawings of people using different mobility devices. We're going to see all these people again, so we'll talk in more detail about the devices they're using and how regulations treat each as we go through. Ben's gone through most of the housekeeping already, so just to be clear that the webinar is 1 hour long as scheduled. The presentation, this is going to be about 40 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for questions. But if there are lots of questions that people want to ask, we can extend by up to about 30 minutes for anybody who wants to stay after the official time. So what we're covering today, we'll start with what we need: equal access to pedestrian and cycling or cycling equivalent mobility for everyone. Then some context. Where are we now and how did we get here? We'll look at factors needed for least restrictive, future-proof regulation to give everyone safe, equitable mobility options. Then lastly, we'll link into the government's mobility devices consultation itself. On the right of this slide, we've again got people using different mobility aids, from a manual wheelchair user using a long cane to people using a rollator and assisting children. So, equal mobility aid regulations need to recognise two key rights. First, everyone needs the right to move as a pedestrian. Disabled people must be regarded in law as pedestrians while we're using mobility aids at pedestrian speeds in all pedestrian spaces. Thinking about safety, we already have regulations that prohibit dangerous or antisocial behaviour by pedestrians, which apply equally to people using mobility aids. What would equal pedestrian rights mean? They'd provide the right to use aids that enable us to move independently, indoors and outdoors, on a wide range of surfaces, to support friends and family who need help moving about, remembering disabled people are often carers, to keep up with people we're with, especially with children and adults we're caring for, to transport our children, our shopping, our luggage and any equipment we need, to hurry away from danger and to keep others safe. We need to be able to make trips at the same sorts of speeds that non-disabled pedestrians can. On the right of this slide, there's a power chair user pulling wheelie luggage behind them. That's probably technically illegal because trailers on invalid carriages are presently forbidden. There's someone using a manual wheelchair with a front power attachment who's accompanying a child using a scooter. And there's somebody walking using an e-assist rollator. Then there's someone who's using a recumbent tricycle, in this slide as a pedestrian. But that takes us on to the right to cycling and cycling equivalent mobility. This is similar to the right to pedestrian mobility, but it's important to separate the two because in spaces reserved for pedestrians, only pedestrian speed mobility should be allowed, whatever devices we're using. So, disabled people must have the right to use our mobility aids at cycling or cycling equivalent speeds in all cycle permitted spaces. That doesn't mean every aid will be able to go at cycling equivalent speeds, but we need to be able to legally choose higher speeds when we have suitable aids in spaces where cycling is legally permitted. Again, laws against dangerous or antisocial behaviour apply equally to mobility aid users. The rights we need for cycling spaces are basically the same as for pedestrian spaces, emphasising that we need to be allowed to move through pedestrian spaces at pedestrian speeds on all mobility aids that are capable of higher speeds. If we can't dismount and push a mobility aid, we need to be able to stay using it slowly through pedestrian spaces, otherwise we can't make journeys at all. On the right of this slide, there are drawings of 3 older children using a power chair, a manual wheelchair with a power attachment and a bicycle. They all look early secondary school age, when most children can make trips independently, but children who need powered aids can't legally go above 4 miles an hour in public spaces until they're 14. Cycling to school is not possible if you need power assist. Below the children, there are 2 people using an inline tandem mobility scooter, which is also illegal in public spaces. We'll talk a bit more about these restrictions later, but first, how we got here. In 1896, motor cars were first allowed to go faster than walking speed. 30 years later, 5,000 or so people were dying per year in crashes. There were tens of thousands of disabled ex-service personnel needing mobility aids after World War One. Some formed the Disabled Drivers Motoring Association, which campaigned for driving access and rights. And simultaneously, some people were campaigning for all disabled people to be banned from all driving. So, in 1930, the Road Traffic Act, intended to improve safety, removed all car speed limits. Driving tests were introduced, but only for disabled people, and the invalid carriage was first defined in law. Invalid carriages were given a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Users had to be at least 16 and have a driving licence. They could go on road only, never on pavements. The reasons why are pretty obvious when we talk a bit more about it. Invalid carriages are mechanically propelled vehicles, the weight of which unladen does not exceed 500 weight, that's about 254 kilos, and which are especially designed and constructed, not merely adapted, for the use of persons suffering from some physical defect or disability and are used solely by such persons. Notice the word persons, which implies you could have multi-person aids. Now, we are not talking about wheelchairs or mobility scooters here. We've got 3 pictures below of the popular Argson invalid trike. As the advert bottom right says, this was available in hand, motor and electric versions. It looks like a big motorbike with 3 wheels and an armchair on top. It's got a number plate, a huge cartoonish front lamp and lever controls. Motor invalid trikes did not have speed restrictors. They could go well above 30 miles an hour. Modernised versions of these, Invacars, were in use into the 1990s. These are motor vehicles, and they're what our invalid carriage laws were designed for. Now we'll skip to after the Second World War, 1948. War, industrial injuries and polio epidemics meant there were thousands of newly disabled people needing and campaigning for mobility options. The government was already providing a lot of these invalid trikes, largely to try and get disabled people into work. Then in 1948, the NHS was founded, and the government took on an even more responsibility for providing people with mobility aids. In 1960, there was the new Road Traffic Act after a lot of campaigning in the 1950s, especially by people needing multi-person devices. I need to transport my children. I need to transport my assistant. I need to take my spouse with me. And in the late 1950s, small powered wheelchairs we'd recognise today were invented. So the new Act changed the definition of an invalid carriage. The word persons from the 1930 Act was changed to a person. After all that campaigning for multi-person vehicles, the option for multi-person devices was carefully removed. So, more campaigning on all sorts of topics like housing, healthcare, employment and education, as well as mobility. The 1970 Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act covered a huge range of provisions for disabled people. It led to the Motability Scheme a few years later and brought in disabled parking badges. Disabled people were getting relatively equal access to motor vehicle mobility, at least on paper. Section 20 of the Act covered personal mobility, paired with the 1970 Use of Invalid Carriages on Highways regulations. These laws started the invalid carriage regulations that we'd recognise today. Use of unpowered wheelchairs was restricted to disabled people only. That was not the case before 1970. And these laws introduced the first powered vehicle category that could be used without a driving licence and in pedestrian spaces, with 4-mile-an-hour maximum speed. Before these laws, we didn't even necessarily have the right to use an unpowered wheelchair on pavement, but now disabled people got the right to use single-person, powered and unpowered low-person speeds on pavements, footpaths and bridleways, as well as on roads. So we're going to jump sideways here, bear with me. We're going to look at cycling regulations. In 1983, the electrically assisted pedal cycles regulations were introduced. This law legalised powered mobility devices which could have any number of wheels, carry any number of people, have trailers and be powered at speeds of up to 15 miles an hour by people without a driving licence on roads, cycle tracks and bridleways. Right, 1988, and it's the new Invalid Carriage on Highways regulations. This is still law today. It defined unpowered wheelchairs as Class 1, powered aids with maximum speed 4 miles an hour as Class 2, and introduced the Class 3 category, which people aged over 14 could use on pavements at up to 4 miles an hour and on roads at up to 8 miles an hour without a driving licence. There are a lot of restrictions on Class 3 devices, but for now, these regulations did not come close to giving disabled people needing powered mobility aids the same mobility as non-disabled people using e-cycles. 7 years on, the Disability Discrimination Act was passed, again after massive campaigns by disabled people. This was a hugely important law. Then the Public Service Vehicles Accessibility Regulations in 2000 gave a right of access to buses for smaller mobility devices. Government commissioned research from 2022 found only about half of all wheelchairs and mobility scooters fit public transport size requirements. In 2010, the Equality Act and the Rail Vehicle Accessibility Regulations were passed. We gained the same access rights for trains that were gained a decade earlier for buses and coaches. A small alteration to invalid carriages rules in 2015 allows for necessary user equipment up to an unladen total device weight of 200 kilos, just for Class 3 in England and Scotland, but for all devices in Wales. That's an important change for people with complex health needs and means children with complex health needs in Wales are better able to access legal aids that meet their needs than children in England or Scotland. So now to 2026. This is the first real reconsideration of mobility aid laws in half a century, and the first since we gained equality and anti-discrimination laws. Current mobility aid laws are denying disabled people equal access to pedestrian, cycling and cycling equivalent mobility. We simply don't have the same rights that non-disabled people do to move about, and this is a chance to transform things for the better. So, what has the government promised to do? Under the Equality Act, the government are required to make all reasonable adjustments to achieve equality of access for disabled people. This is an anticipatory duty. It has to be done before anyone experiences discrimination, and it requires all reasonable physical changes and changes to rules, policies and procedures to be made to facilitate equal access for disabled people. The public sector equality duty goes further. The government are required to have due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity for disabled people, really promoting access for disabled people. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which the UK is a signatory, says, "States parties shall take effective measures to ensure personal mobility with the greatest possible independence for persons with disabilities, including by facilitating the personal mobility of persons with disabilities in the manner and at the time of their choice and at affordable cost, and by facilitating access by persons with disabilities to quality mobility aids, devices, assistive technologies and forms of live assistance and intermediaries, including by making them available at affordable cost." We are not close to meeting these requirements with our current regulations. We need new mobility aid regulations, and they must be made to meet the requirements of the Equality Act and of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now we'll consider grey areas in rules, misunderstandings and bans. When we're talking about the need for better regulations, people often say, well, no one's going to enforce that rule, just do it anyway. Or, I don't think that's the rules, I think this is the rules. Or, aren't there more important things to work on? There's so much confusion. We're not infallible by any stretch. Everybody is confused about these laws in many ways. So on the right, we need to make it clear that unclear laws, discriminatory bans and misunderstandings are harming people. On the right, a graphic says, careless laws cost rights. That's what unclear discriminatory laws do. The graphic has people using different mobility aids coming out through prohibition signs like the Ghostbusters logo. What harms are happening? Let's have a couple of examples. In government guidance, it says Class 2 powered aids can't be used on road if there's a pavement. The Highway Code disagrees, and we're pretty sure it's not right. But mobility aid users have told us they believe they have to use the pavement even when it's dangerous through being broken, steep or obstructed and is next to an empty, smooth carriageway. Other people believe their aids are Class 1, but Class 1 is a powered device only in highways laws. People are confusing medical device categories with invalid carriage categories, understandably. So some people with high-speed capable devices are using them in ways that we think should be legal anyway, in public spaces, but they're not realising they're putting themselves at risk of legal action and of confiscation of their aids, which we know has been happening. Discrimination is happening. People with safe, legal devices are being refused access into public transport, into services, and even into their own homes. Risk of enforcement and discrimination makes getting around much more difficult. And a lack of safe products forces people to take risks. At the moment, there are no commercially available devices to carry children on or attached to mobility aids. We know one organisation thinks there's enough of a legal grey area that if you attach a pushchair to the front of a wheelchair, it's neither a trailer nor a two-person device. But leaving the law worded like this is discriminatory and dangerous, even if there may be tiny loopholes. Our current regulations need sorting out. New mobility aid rules and associated product standards must be easy to find, written in clear language, and freely available to everyone in accessible formats. So let's look a bit more closely at risks. Sometimes people say things like, I don't think that should be allowed because I would feel unsafe doing it, or I don't think that should be allowed, the person doing it might get hurt, or if disabled people are allowed to do that, someone else might get hurt. Let's have a think about those points. First one, rights aren't requirements. You don't have to use your rights, but you don't have a right to ban other people from doing things just because you don't want to, or even to keep those people safe. We know many people choose not to cycle because of safety concerns. That's completely reasonable, and it doesn't affect what anyone else can choose to do. Then we often celebrate and incentivise individual risk-taking. We fund high-level sports despite knowing athletes get injured. And we celebrate people doing extreme adventuring like crossing the Antarctic. We don't ban these activities. We also shouldn't be banning people from using mobility aids that would let them go to the supermarket with their partner and grandchildren. And lastly, we need to remember that both direct and indirect risks matter. So here we've got a picture of somebody who's using a mobility scooter with a child trailer towed behind it, shown as an alternative to the same people using a car for their trip. If more people use mobility devices, then more incidents involving mobility devices are likely to happen. But what about the risks that are reduced at the same time? Better mobility is likely to help more people live healthier lives, support their families, make community connections. This benefits everyone, including people who don't use mobility devices, especially where having suitable mobility devices enables people to use small, lightweight, low-speed, zero-emission devices instead of using cars and SUVs for trips. Better mobility aid options can help people stop or reduce driving, especially older people who might be losing the capacity to drive safely. We need to both mitigate risk from use of mobility devices and recognise the huge harms caused by preventing people from having access to suitable pedestrian and cycling equivalent mobility options. Risk assessment starts with presuming we all have the capacity to make reasonable decisions. So, in decision-making involving disabled people, there's often an assumption that disabled people need to be prevented from hurting ourselves or others in a way that doesn't happen when decisions are being made about activities that are expected to be mostly carried out by non-disabled people. For example, mobility aid laws have barely changed in half a century, but autonomous vehicles and e-scooters are being legalised at speed. It's discriminatory to prevent a large number of disabled people from accessing pedestrian and cycling or cycling equivalent mobility in order to prevent small numbers of disabled and non-disabled people from behaving in ways that put others at risk. By default, all disabled and non-disabled people have the capacity to make our own decisions. Parents, carers, and relevant professionals judge when a child has capacity to make their own decisions in difficult areas. If an adult is not thought to have capacity, professionals assess them, then appointed supporters are responsible for keeping a person who lacks capacity safe and for ensuring they don't endanger others. And again, if people who have capacity behave antisocially or dangerously towards others, they can and should face civil or criminal penalties. Disabled people are best placed to determine which aids are best for us. On the right of this slide, we've got people using 2 devices that are legal and a third that is not. Someone is riding a bike with a child seat on the back and a child being towed in a trailer behind. Someone is pushing a double buggy, and our friend from the last slide is using a mobility scooter towing a child trailer behind it. The mobility scooter user is breaking the law. Our regulations currently treat mobility devices mostly like motor vehicles, except even motorbikes are allowed trailers. Devices designated for disabled people are restricted in ways that devices designed primarily for non-disabled people are not. A default assumption that disabled people lack capacity to make decisions has led to discriminatory regulations. The assumption of capacity is really, really important, so we'll go into a bit more detail. On the right, there's a graphic saying the right to choose mobility aids should be no more controversial than the right to choose shoes. A person is pointing at lots of different shoes and different mobility aids. With mobility aids, we are mostly talking about pedestrian rights, the right to walking equivalent mobility. That must not be restricted in law for anyone, whatever our impairments. Requiring tests or excluding any group of disabled people from powered aid use would exclude some people from all independent movement. And there are safe, unpowered and powered aids out there for everyone. There are multi-person aids like tandems, triplets and wheelchair and person transporters. They are brilliant for supporting people who aren't able or don't want to travel independently some or all of the time. We have supported use aids, so ones where you can connect aids together or where somebody can help another person use the aid. And we have hazard avoidance technology, similar to what cars can have. So people with impairments that make it difficult to control an aid fully all the time can't go off a curb or a steep gradient by mistake and can't bump into anything or anyone. There's no reason to legally restrict mobility aid use based on impairments, any more than we legally restrict walking or cycling based on impairments. But we also restrict invalid carriages to disabled people only, while comparable devices with really similar functions aren't recognised formally as mobility aids. Looking at the right of the slide, we've got 5 people using aids. Top left, using a small mobility scooter, that's legally a Class 2 invalid carriage, which can be used on pedestrian permitted spaces and on road up to 4 miles an hour. Top right, using a manual wheelchair with e-assist hand cycle attachment, that's legally a cycle, probably not permitted on pavements, but permitted on all cycle permitted spaces at any speed, including cycle tracks, cycle lanes, bus lanes, bridleways and restricted byways. Bottom left, using an assistant-propelled manual wheelchair, that's legally a Class 1 aid, useful but not good on tricky terrain or for longer distances, and the assistant is at risk of injury, especially on uneven pavements or soft ground, and if they are disabled, as is often the case. Bottom middle, using a folding bicycle with crutches attached, again, that's legally a cycle. And bottom right, using a sit-on e-scooter that's very comparable to the Class 2 mobility scooter, except this one's currently illegal in all public spaces. So, the restriction of invalid carriages to disabled people only and the lack of recognition of more diverse, comparable devices as mobility aids is really limiting access to practical, cost-effective mobility and to physical activity for disabled people. Using an invalid carriage is stigmatised. Shorewise have done some great investigation of the harassment and abuse people using mobility scooters face. Many people avoid using devices they need or avoid making journeys because of the risk of harassment and abuse, both when using invalid carriages and when using devices that aren't widely recognised as mobility aids. Non-disabled people who need to use aids are barred from use, which will become more important when multi-person devices are permitted, but really, why are we restricting use of small, low-speed, low-carbon mobility devices that are comparable to cycles and to micromobility, which we understand is soon to be legalised? Couldn't devices like mobility scooters be used on roads and cycle infrastructure to help more non-disabled people switch trips from driving to safer, more community-scale options? And so the market for mobility devices is, we think, being kept artificially small. That keeps prices high, it stifles innovation, quality and diversity of available devices. We need to allow disabled and non-disabled people to use all legal devices, but with pedestrian access rights and VAT exemptions only given to disabled people using those devices as mobility aids. Now we're going to have a look at some different criteria around device use. First, age. Age restrictions come up a lot in the government consultation. So let's think about what we need mobility devices to enable. We need young people to be able to play, learn and gain independence to make journeys with their friends, family and alone. Young people need to be able to move on made surfaces and uneven and soft surfaces too at walking, running and cycling speeds. Remember, under 14s who need power to move currently aren't allowed to go above 4 miles an hour in any public spaces. Then, working age people often have caring responsibilities for others of all ages. Working age people often need to trip chain, like in the graphic. There's a person using a power chair with a pram attached, assisting a child who's on a balance bike next to them. A person using an e-assist cargo trike with 4 children in the front compartment. And our friend, the person using a mobility scooter with a child trailer on the back. All these people are saying the sorts of things I'm sure many of us will recognise. Nursery drop-off, school, work, prescriptions, pick up kids, visit auntie, home for dinner, swimming, bedtime, no problem. We all need to make our journeys in a timely fashion. We need regulations that enable disabled people to make trips in the same timeframes as non-disabled people. And we need to ensure older people are considered, people who are often experiencing increasing levels of personal impairment while caring for others of all ages. Older people often need to stop or reduce driving while maintaining their independence and function. How do we ensure disabled people of all ages have equal mobility options compared to their same age peers? We need to remove age, passenger number and towing restrictions from mobility devices, and we need to allow cycling equivalent powered speeds for mobility devices in all spaces where cycling is permitted. We've looked at multi-person aids, but we also need to be able to move in groups using different aids or none, supporting each other. And a company group is where the combined needs of group members mean the group can't split up safely. On the right, there are pictures of the same accompanied group walking, wheeling and cycling. Top right, there's an adult using a mobility scooter, an adult pushing a double buggy with 2 babies, and a child using a scooter. Let's say the person using the mobility scooter can support the child, for example, staying between them and drivers, but may themselves need support at junctions. For example, maybe they can't really judge vehicle speeds. Then bottom left, the same group now has the child cycling and the adult who had the double buggy riding a bike with a baby seat on the back and the other baby towed in a trailer. The person on the mobility scooter is still supporting that cycling child and still may need assistance themselves. This group cannot split up whether they're walking, wheeling or cycling. For mobility equality, we need to move in accompanied groups, the same sorts of sizes that could travel in a car, so anywhere from about 2 to 8 people. For public space rules, we're just bringing some ideas from earlier together. Disabled people need to be able to complete trips at comparable speeds to non-disabled people. We need to be able to move at safe speeds for the locations we're in, leave our mobility devices in safe locations, and be trusted to use our judgment to keep ourselves and others safe. We already trust mobility aid users to slow down to appropriate speeds. On busy pavements, shopping centres, train and bus stations, typical speeds will be 1 to 2 miles an hour tops. And almost all mobility device users slow down appropriately, just as almost all pedestrians do. In some spaces, we need to go faster. In the picture on the right, there's someone using a manual wheelchair with a power attachment under a streetlight. It's dark and a group of people are standing worryingly nearby. It's great there's more talk about safety for women and girls making journeys at all times. Disabled people are at increased risk of assaults, harassment and being hit by drivers. We need to be included in all safety considerations with running equivalent and cycling equivalent options to get away from danger, whatever the cause. And again, we need to continue to apply the same rules against antisocial and dangerous behaviour in public spaces to everyone. We've looked at rules. Now, what about device specifications for accessing different spaces? Least restrictive, future-proof regulations need to ensure devices used in public spaces are safe without adding unnecessary criteria. We think it makes sense to have weight limits. Ramps, lifts and vehicles have safe maximum loads, and we need to use standard infrastructure to get around. We can discuss what those maximum weights should be, of course. Maximum dimensions we think make sense too. We think we need more than one device class based on dimensions for different devices for different purposes. So, for example, the smallest device class would be devices with dimensions where users are provided with the right to access everywhere, indoors and out, including homes and small venues. Then a larger specification for devices where users have the right to access public transport and bigger venues. And an even bigger outdoor devices category too, for the right to use outdoor public spaces. On the right side of the slide, there are pictures along the top of people using small devices, which would go into the right to access everywhere category. A small mobility scooter, a folding cycle, a sit-on scooter, a wheelchair with a power attachment and a power chair. Then along the bottom, big outdoor devices, a recumbent trike, a side-by-side tandem trike, and a mobility scooter with a child trailer attached. That would just need separating to have the right of access in small spaces. And a tandem mobility scooter. You'd usually expect to leave devices this big in cycle parking when you get to a destination. We think it makes sense to set maximum powered speeds for mobility devices, aligning those with e-cycles or e-scooter maximum powered speeds. We think it makes sense to have clear braking requirements, like the current e-scooter trials braking requirements, and lighting requirements at night, just as cycles have now. Device specifications for access rights are different from product safety regulations, which can be much more detailed and specified differently for different types of devices. People buying or being provided with devices must be able to check how they should work. That especially applies to things like electrical safety, so batteries, motors, chargers, and to hazard avoidance, especially brakes and stability, and how features like speed limiters should work. Putting detailed specifications into public spaces regulations ends up with outdated and unreasonably restrictive requirements. So we need up-to-date safety and performance requirements for certification of different device types to be publicly available in accessible formats. In the pictures here, top left, we have two people using an e-assist tandem with a detachable wheelchair. That's a Van Ramo pair. It's a cycle version of a train-type connectable mobility device, which is of course legal to use already. There's a case study of a family who use one on our website. And this also shows how a non-disabled person may need to use a mobility device with a disabled person. Top right, we have an adult and child riding bikes that are connected with a tow bar, a common, legal, separable mobility device which enables travel on roads or for longer journeys until the users are somewhere the child can safely travel independently, and then the devices can be separated. Bottom left, we have the person using a power chair with luggage towed behind again. And again, at the moment, that's probably illegal. And bottom right, the person using an e-assist rollator with shopping capacity. Another really useful innovation. We need to ensure regulations don't block use of safe devices that are enabled by new technologies. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a look more closely at the consultation contents. There's a lot about aligning requirements for power chairs and cycles with Class 3 requirements, and we need to make it clear that that is just not possible or reasonable. For example, devices that can freewheel, like cycles and some new e-assist devices, cannot have speed restrictors. Then, as well as 8 mph maximum speed and 4 mph restrictor switches, Class 3 devices must have indicators, hazard warning lights, a rear view mirror, a horn, carry one person only, no trailers, fixed front and rear lights, a speedometer, brakes and reflectors. They're restricted to disabled people aged 14 plus only and require DVLA registration. Very comparable tricycles require almost none of that. They need working brakes and lights at night, very sensibly. And if they're e-assist, they have minimum age 14 and maximum powered speed of 15.5 miles an hour, almost double the maximum speed under power of a Class 3 device. Government guidance says it's not permitted to use Class 3 devices on cycle lanes or bus lanes. Class 3 devices must stay at 4 miles an hour or less on other cycle permitted spaces, including cycle tracks, bridleways and restricted byways. We're putting resources with more details about these restrictions on our website soon because they sound so loopy that mostly people don't realise they exist. Class 3 regulations are simply not fit for purpose. But we believe that the point of this consultation is to achieve inclusive, equitable, future-proofed mobility aid regulations. And we think this can happen rapidly. The upcoming low-speed, zero-emission framework could be used to provide legal recognition for all pedestrian and cycling equivalent devices as mobility aids when used by a disabled person to assist with or replace pedestrian movement. And the framework could implement equal access rights for mobility aid users with non-disabled pedestrians in all pedestrian access spaces and with non-disabled cyclists in all cycle permitted spaces. Value-added tax exemptions for current invalid carriages are really important. Aids like specialist power chairs can cost £30,000, and the people who need these generally do not have any other options. We think a way to ensure VAT exemptions are retained could be to keep the invalid carriage regulations, and a name change to mobility devices really would be nice. And even better, to extend this VAT exempt category to all mobility devices that are certified as Class 1 medical devices, as is the case in many other countries. We would like VAT exemptions extended to all devices when they're used as aids by disabled people too, but we're aware that's a much bigger ask and is very complex with negotiations with the Treasury. So the last thing we're going to do is run through where everything in this presentation fits into the government consultation questions, and I'm really sorry that this slide is chaos. That is because the consultation questions are a bit all over the place in terms of concepts that are covered. There are lots of really important themes in the consultation, and we've detailed resources on our website to help everyone with responding. We will be sharing our fully referenced question by question consultation response once it's ready. So questions 1 to 6 cover issues around defining mobility devices, including really problematic ideas about splitting access rights for those with and without assessed clinical need for a device, as well as looking at changing the term invalid carriage and about the disabled only restriction of devices. Then age restrictions appear in questions 8 to 9, 18 to 19, 20 to 23, 24 to 27 and 28 to 30. You're going to spot a lot of repetition with these question numbers. And that includes direct references to restricting by age, but also indirect restrictions via anything to do with Class 3 restrictions. Device specifications are in questions 10 to 13, 14 to 17, 20 to 23, 24 to 27 and 28 to 30. That's considering weight limits, Class 3 requirements and access rights to different spaces. And then safe use of spaces and permitted use locations are in questions 1 to 2, 8 to 9, 14 to 17, 24 to 27 and 28 to 30. Again, looking at access rights and permitted speeds and needing a focus on that presumption of competence. Risks and benefits of changing mobility regulations are in questions 1 to 2, 17, 19, 20 to 23, 24, 27 and 30. This consultation really is phrased and a bit skewed to consider device-specific risks, not direct or wider benefits, which, as we've discussed, are really, really important. And just to reiterate that the goal here is regulations which will allow equal access to mobility for all disabled people. So thank you everyone for listening. And again, we're putting up loads of resources, including all the references for everything we're saying, and a lot more background on mobility aid regulations and their effects on our Every Journey Everyone campaign page, and the QR code goes to that page. So I'll just stop screen recording, screen sharing, and put my camera back on. And do we have any questions, please?
First question. A participant is curious about recommendations for mobility devices using trains and buses.
Okay, so on our webpage, we've got some campaign information on that for trikes on trains. So that's on our main resources page. Devices using buses and trains at the moment, it's a little bit variable. If you're using a wheelchair that's within the reference wheelchair size, which is, I think it's 1.2 meters long by 0.7 meters wide, you should be allowed to use any train or bus, provided that that it's a wheelchair in any of the invalid carriage classes. If you're using a mobility scooter or out of class aids, it gets much more complex. Some bus companies and tram companies especially will often let you on, but it's a bit touch and go. And whether you actually can get onto a bus or train is another matter entirely, whether or not you technically have the right to do it. Is that about the right sort of answer, Ben?
it wasn't my question, but
Okay.
it strikes me that one of the issues there is the risk that you might be able to make your outward journey and then be told that you're not allowed on the way back, which
Mm.
would be a very scary situation to be in. So to remind people, please do put any questions you have in the chat. You can access it using the speech bubbles above the word chat, and then you need to start a new chat when you're there to send me the question. Um, I have a question myself, Kate.
Okay.
Why
Just to
hasn't
say, sorry, can I just, everyone's welcome to put cameras on and put hands up if you have questions to ask as well. That's absolutely fine. In fact, we'd welcome it. Sorry, Ben.
why hasn't the Equality Act meant that the discrimination in the regulations just been automatically overturned when it was passed in 2010?
This is where I have to put my I'm not a lawyer hat on. I don't know why, but you have to challenge any discrimination under the Equality Act individually as a disabled person or somebody who's personally affected. Um, so my suspicion would be it's because nobody has managed to take a case this enormous. And of course, judicial reviews have to be done within 3 months of an original decision being made. The Equality Act wasn't implemented when the last sets of significant decisions were made about mobility devices. I think we were, 14 years too late or something, 12 years too late.
It, Interesting thought, interesting thought. I will generally unmute people. It will take a while for me to get through, but people are very welcome to try putting their hands up equally to.
Siobhan,
uh,
hello.
Hello. First of all, just want to really thank you because I found this really, really helpful, and I'll be glad when you send out the advice that can go with all the various links to the which questions you answer, and that was really good. Can you just remind me? I know it'll be on the government page, but what's the deadline that we have to submit?
22nd of April, they've extended it. So it was the end of March, now it's towards the back end of April.
Good. And can you just tell me a little bit of background about what Wheels for Wellbeing have been doing in terms of your own um, offering advice to government in this consultation? So obviously we can all come at it as individuals, but just tell us a bit about what you're doing if you don't mind.
Um, yeah, so we've been talking with the Department for Transport and doing lots of presentations for organisations like Active Travel England, and lots of regional organisations and other NGOs for quite a lot of years on this sort of thing. We've really ramped up since this announcement. We weren't expecting it, so we were really pleased last summer when the government announced the review of mobility aid regulations, and we understand that that was at least in part due to the discussions that we'd been having with the Department for Transport, which was really great. We had understood there was going to be a consultation on the LZEV framework, this low speed zero emissions framework that's going to be legalizing, hopefully, micromobility, that's the intent. We hadn't realised this consultation was going to happen first. And so we've had to mobilise on this pretty fast. Our resources were angled slightly wrong. Um, but yeah, so we have discussions, but we don't have any particular influence over any groups. We're a part of all party parliamentary groups for walking and cycling, and we talk to people a lot, but that's where it goes. So if anyone else has any questions or been anything in the chat, this is the bit where it feels like I've
Oh,
just hit everyone over the head
no,
with a textbook.
I've got one. I've just got to click in the right place. Um, so um, the question sort of saying we'll bring this to the attention of another inclusive mobility group. Um, what is the best way for us to support? Is it to submit consultation responses that are aligned in our own words?
We're very much hoping that people will be able to submit consultation responses and will feel able to align their responses to ours. So we're just trying to provide everyone with all the information so that you can decide whether you agree with us or not. You know, we're not telling everybody they have to agree with us. That's not how it works, but we're hoping to persuade people that what we're saying is sensible and reasonable and aligned with equalities regulations, so that people feel able to support what we're saying. But yes, please, if you could align with us, that'd be brilliant.
So, a question about walking distances, the distance between where a mobility device needs to be stored and the eventual destination.
Okay, so what we say when we're doing consultations and work on strategies for organisations is that inclusive cycle parking, and that would include for all mobility devices, needs to be the same distance or closer to your destination's accessible entrances, which should be the main entrance, compared to disabled parking for motor vehicles as well. Because our restrictions on disability benefits sort of recognise a walking speed of a distance of 20 metres, and that's really not very far. And I think it's worth adding in here, we have a lot of talk about things like 15-minute cities, 15-minute neighbourhoods, and that's great as a concept. We really, really support that kind of local mobility, and it's really good for disabled people. But we need to be recognising that unpowered aids and anything that only goes at 4 miles an hour, even 15 minutes is assumed at sort of a kilometre, a bit more than a kilometre. That's further than most people using an unpowered wheelchair can go in a whole day, every bit of movement. There was a study that was done collating information on movement of athletes, disabled athletes who are wheelchair users. And they were averaging a kilometre and a half of movement per day. That's all their movement from the moment they got out of bed to the moment they went back to bed again. Every single bit was a kilometre and a half. So we need to have powered aids to get around neighbourhoods. It's not even vaguely optional. An unpowered aid will not do it.
Right. Um, Another question about how long people should allow to complete the consultation once our question by question guide is ready.
Oh, so how long is a piece of string? It's taking us weeks to prepare this because it's really complicated, and we're making sure we've dug around all of the regulations and all the laws and things that seem to go in circles. Anywhere from about half an hour up to however long you want to spend on it. As we've said, the questions tend to cover a lot of the same things. We think that the Department for Transport are likely to split question by question to analyse the responses, and I believe they're using AI for some of their analysis. So our feeling is we're going to need to put all of the information that we need for every single question into every single individual question. That's going to mean that we have a really, really long and really repetitive response. But because of the way we suspect they're going to be analysing it, that's going to be necessary. Of course, anyone answering the questionnaire does not have to do that. And it would be much quicker just to say, refer to my answer to question 2 when you're on to question 14 or whatever it might be. Um, so yeah, really, really variable. Depends how much personal experience you want to put in, depends how much content you want to put in. But yeah, anything from about half an hour upwards, I would guess. Just it's sort of 20 odd questions ish. Well, sorry, 30 questions ish. But quite a few of them are yes, no.
It seems worthwhile and sensible just to open up to a more general free flowing chat at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah, if anyone wants to join in, take part in such a chat, please do so. If you're finding that you can't unmute yourself, I'm sorry, I will sort that out. It doesn't tell me, who is able to unmute themselves and who isn't. I hoped I'd achieved that with everyone.
Oh, I think Teresa's talking, but she's gone muted again. I think maybe she got double unmuted.
Or maybe Teresa was you know, with someone in the background, and it seems like we've not got people anxious to. Oh,
Oh, sorry, I can't, I'm struggling. Can I just come in? Can you hear me?
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
please.
Right. I'm struggling to operate in Zoom. It's been a while, so I'm struggling to find the hand up and everything. Anyway, but I'll just blurt it out. I suppose thank you so much for putting the detail into this. It's really interesting and helpful and instructive. So my feeling is, it sounds really good that you had a really good engagement with Active Travel England, for example, as an organisation. I wonder if this is more coming from the kind of that technical vehicle DFT type team. It sounds like some of it perhaps is. And I suppose I'm wondering how effective your engagement's been with that kind of team to help them understand the bigger picture and kind of move hearts and minds as well, because there might be a bit of a BAU risk averse approach. I don't know. I'm speculating. I've never worked with that team, but I just yeah. So I just wondered how those conversations were looking, because sometimes, as you know, in doing legislation, you can do things inadvertently, perhaps, or without understanding the bigger picture. And this feels like such a strong case, just from the way you've presented it. So I would hope that if you can find the right people, perhaps it's a better way forward.
Yeah, we've been talking with the DFT's micromobilities team for the last couple of years, and they brought in, but because of what we were saying, they brought in people to do a high level review of mobility aid things early last year. And then by the summer of last year, they had permanent members of the team working on mobility aid regulations, which is when this review was also called. So we had assumed from the team that's working on it that this would be coming in very much from a micro mobility perspective. We know that the team involved really do understand the sort of equalities implications and the importance of ensuring. So sort of one way around, the importance of ensuring that micromobility devices are inclusive of disabled people. So we've talked with them a lot about needing multi-wheeled vehicles, not just two wheels, one in front of the other, about needing seats, about needing multi-person capacity. And so we know all those things are up for discussion with micromobility. Because this consultation is coming at it from a slightly different perspective, we're needing to make really, really clear, and it's a slightly oddly written consultation. The phrasing has surprised us, to say the least, because we have been working with a team that we're like, we don't think you wrote this consultation, I guess. So yeah, it seemed a bit odd, but we know that the team that's working on this are really, really strong and really have a good approach. So we're very, very hopeful about the contents of what's going to go forwards.
That's really good to hear. Like, big departments have lots of different teams and things. You can get a bit, I don't know what the polite word is, but yeah, separated perhaps, or whatever.
It can be really difficult to communicate between different bits of an organisation all the time, can't it?
Yeah, certainly can. Thanks.
Hi, Ben and Kate. Mark from
Hi, Mark.
WMG here. Yeah, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Really, really well put together, really well presented. I'm particularly interested in the sort of the technology detection, avoidance, collision sort of aspects of this and what's being done in wheelchairs. I guess the one area of contention, and I'm struggling to phrase it in a way that comes across well, is the use of mobility scooters and powered wheelchairs for people who don't need them, and that's something you've from looking at what you've said, you've justified from a use of it stifling the market from an affordability point of view, and I wonder how that contradict sort of active travel agendas from stopping people from walking who are able to walk, are being given a less active option. Being given options is good, but sort of taking people away from active travel is bad. So how does that balancing act work?
Well, so we know that people who run half marathons at the weekend often drive to work. And we might like it if they stop driving to work, but we don't tell them they have to start running to work, even though we know they're quite capable of doing that. We have an awful lot of people who don't call themselves disabled. I've just got a bit of a dodgy hip. I just can't go that far. I can't go that far pushing a pushchair with my three grandkids in it. I can't. So we've got an awful lot of people who are on that sort of transition point. I can't bring my shopping back up that hill. They might need something powered to make journeys, and that will allow people to be a lot more active, especially people who cannot have driving licenses or can't drive. And 45% of disabled working age people do not have a driving license. So this is a huge proportion of people, many of whom can walk, many of whom can walk a fair way, but won't be able to make all the journeys that they need to make by walking. So it's about giving the same sort of rights that we expect people to have for driving. We don't tell everyone to get out the car and cycle. We'd love them to. We say it'd be a great idea if you cycled all these journeys. It'd be a great idea if you walked or ran all these journeys, but we don't say you may not drive them. And at the moment, we're saying you may not use a mobility scooter, even though you might well not be able to make the trip. And we're also talking about multi-person aids, where you might well need a non-disabled person controlling that aid. Sorry, Ben, did you put your hand up?
Yeah, it was just another thing that really struck me on this is a really direct comparison with e-scooters.
Oh, yeah.
E-scooters have exactly the same issue, that they encourage people to do something which isn't as much exercise as they would do otherwise. And the devices we're talking about are very rarely going to be used in preference to an e-scooter, except by someone who has got an impairment. They might not think in terms of calling it disabled. And there's been a comment that's come in here from one of the participants. I've been disabled for 40 years, but I've only just got to the point where I use the term disabled. That sort of sums up why you can't limit them to people that use the word disabled about themselves.
And it's probably worth just noting that if you are power chairs, there is probably zero chance of anyone who's non-disabled choosing to use a power chair, because they're really expensive. I mean, they are really expensive. You're going to choose an e-scooter first, or a bike, or something, something that gives you the equivalent options. It's not going to be a huge issue. If somebody genuinely finds a power chair useful, it's probably because they're disabled, even if they don't call themselves that. Sorry, Robin.
Yeah, yes, I was going to say yeah, there's a fun aspect to that as well, isn't it? There's some of these are more fun than others. The we make a lot of provision for disabled motor car driving, and yet there are 1/4 of people who can't drive. And that is partly because of disablement and partly because of financial cost. And so a lot of these options are going to be lower cost and frankly more useful because you can get to more places. Um, and so there's a whole lot to gain in terms of accessibility, both physical and affordability here, which I think you made quite clear. But I think that the motor normative nature of our society, it kind of works against us. And I'm sure we've all heard the kind of, oh yes, but you to say the kind of normative version of this is that disabled people tend to drive everywhere, but that's simply not true. I mean, there's far far more people are able to cycle, let alone some form of pedestrianisation, than can drive. And
Well, and of
we need to get
course,
that across.
yeah, and of course, more people can drive, and a lot of disabled people are trapped into car dependency
Yes,
because there aren't the options that would allow you not to be trapped in car dependency. So whether that's being driven or driving yourself, an awful lot of people now need to use vehicles in a way that they
yes.
wouldn't if they had better options available.
And then when they can't, they're really stuck. And of course, for children, zero of them can drive.
Yeah, and it's really expensive.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Sorry, Kay, did you want
Which
to?
is why we all love Wheels for Wellbeing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I was going to try and be quiet for an hour, but I can't. I was just going to say, yeah, picking up on the thing about people who are not disabled, either in terms of their own definition or the legal definition, using what are currently invalid carriages. I think there's some really good examples. So, for example, pregnancy, because it lasts less than a year, is not classed as a disability. And yet, often during pregnancy, people can find their mobility is really impaired and might benefit from some kind of shared scheme of a power chair or maybe a tandem mobility scooter if they've got kids or need to transport people, in the same way that there's other devices that are shared against pregnancy groups like breast pumps, for example. So you could see that as being somewhere where there's a group of people who could really benefit from something that currently is only for disabled people. And I think the other thing that is really important as well is if you can't identify someone as being disabled by the vehicle that they're moving around on, that eliminates a whole lot of harassment and discrimination and public hostility and stigma for disabled people as well. Because it's like non-disabled people get to move around on all kinds of weird and wonderful things and aren't targeted in the same way as disabled people. So it really takes away that sort of social stigma and identification of disabled people, which effectively makes us a lot safer.
And I think what we've been saying to the DFT, sort of in line with that and in line with this concept, is because of the risk of losing the VAT exemptions for the current invalid carriage category, that is an absolute priority to not hit that. So it said, why don't we just keep those regulations and then put the LZEV regulations, the low speed zero emission vehicles, over the top. So if it's not classed as an invalid carriage category, or you aren't classed as someone who's allowed to use an invalid carriage, then whether it's got a seat or two seats or a child carrier on the back or a cargo compartment or however many wheels it's got, if it's powered and it goes up to or below the maximum powered speed that's permitted for highways use, then anybody can use it as a micro-mobility vehicle on roads and on cycle infrastructure. But you can only bring it down to pedestrian speeds in pedestrian spaces if you are disabled and using it as a mobility aid. So whether that's a three-wheeled, officially it's a e-scooter, or whether that's a three-wheeled mobility scooter, anybody could use it. Because if we keep the split between it's powered and we're calling it an invalid carriage versus it's powered, it functions in exactly the same way, but we're calling it an e-scooter, you end up with this situation where disabled people can't use that device to get where they need to go because we're not allowed to stay on it in pedestrian spaces, which is an absolute killer for making journeys if you can't walk.
It seems like we've pretty much exhausted people's brain power for this session. And we did only advertise it as an hour anyway. So thanks so much for everyone for being here. Please keep an eye on the web page where there will be the information on the detailed answers that we're suggesting for each of the questions. We'd be very, very glad if you're able to put in your own responses, putting those sorts of answers into your own words and adding in your own interests and experiences as appropriate. So
and again, please do come back to us with any questions or further stuff. We really like challenging questions because they let us change what we're saying and adapt and make sure that we're saying things that make sense, make sure that we're getting things right. And if anyone spots any errors in our resources, again, please say, or if something doesn't make sense.
Right. So thanks very much, everyone. And I'm going to end the meeting here.
Thank you.